What happens when a starving frontier baron builds a modern city inside a medieval empire? The answer begins with asphalt roads, flush toilets, black powder, and nobles too greedy to understand any of it. In the Valoria Empire, Silas was supposed to be the poorest lord on the frontier. His territory, 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏, was marked on every royal map as a frozen backwater. The report said 2,000 starving serfs lived there. The report said famine struck year after year. The report said the land was too poor to pay even a single copper in tax. Those reports were all lies. Because Silas was not an ordinary young noble, he had transmigrated from another world. He remembered factories, roads, plumbing, advertising, medicine, and weapons. So when he woke up as a penniless baron, he did not pray for mercy. He did not begin with swords, armies, or royal favors. He began with the only weapon a starving transmigrator could afford: moonshine. He earned his first pot of gold. Then he used that gold to turn mud huts into stone streets. He turned hungry serfs into paid workers. He turned a forgotten borderland into the richest little monster in the empire. 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 had clean water. 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 had sewers. 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 had shops packed on both sides of the road. Its people had red cheeks, full stomachs, and enough meat to grow fat. There were no beggars in the city. There were only workers, merchants, guards, craftsmen, and citizens who worshipped their strange baron. Silas planned to quietly grow richer while pretending to remain poor. But heaven had a bad habit of sending trouble to his doorstep. One day, Emperor Richard left the royal capital in secret. He brought only his chief chamberlain, Godfrey. Their goal was simple. They wanted to inspect 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 without revealing their identities. Godfrey held the map inside the shaking carriage. His face twisted with disgust as the mountain road smashed their bones. He was certain 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 would be a miserable hole. Richard also sighed, regretting that he had not ridden a horse instead. Then the carriage hit a rut so hard Godfrey flew into the roof. His head slammed against the oak boards. He crawled out, clutching his skull, and cursing the coachman. But the coachman only pointed ahead with a trembling finger. Godfrey turned. His eyes almost burst from their sockets. Behind them was mud. Ahead of them was a perfectly straight, black-gray road. It shone faintly under the sun. Smooth stone blocks wrapped both sides with clean edges. Richard stepped out and froze. A frontier baron had somehow built an asphalt road. The carriage rolled onto it. The shaking vanished instantly. No bumps, no mud, only wind across green fields and wheels gliding like silk. Richard's frown slowly relaxed. He whispered that this baron was interesting. But the road was only the first slab. Soon a towering fortress rose on the horizon. Gray-white walls stood more than a dozen meters high. The name 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 was carved above the city gate in bold, ornate lettering. That single name hit Richard harder than a war banner. Richard's mood darkened immediately. He had fought wars for years, yet even important cities lack such defenses. He turned coldly toward Godfrey. He asked why royal intelligence had never reported this fortress. Godfrey dropped to his knees on the asphalt. He had never even heard this place mattered. To him, 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 had always been a forgotten mountain grave. Now, that grave had city walls strong enough to make generals sweat. Richard dismissed the coachman. Then he and Godfrey walked to the gate like ordinary merchants. 3 uniformed guards stopped them. They demanded transit documents. Godfrey presented papers and claimed his master traded porcelain. Richard tested the guards casually. He asked whether such walls must have cost the people heavy taxes. One guard immediately burst out laughing. Another guard sighed, pulled out copper coins, and paid a bet. Apparently every outsider asked the same thing. The guard explained that the walls were mostly decorative. Silas hated ugly dirt walls, so he pasted stone slabs over them. The carvings were just patterns. The cost was not terrifying at all. Richard laughed, thinking that Silas had refined taste. In a good mood, he told Godfrey to tip the guard with the silver coin. But the guard's face instantly hardened. He refused the coin and declared that 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 did not accept bribes. Godfrey stood there awkwardly with the silver in his fingers. He had seen greedy nobles, greedy judges, and greedy priests. But a guard refusing money seemed more unnatural than magic. Richard walked through the gate with curiosity burning in his chest. And the moment he entered the city, curiosity turned into shock. 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 was not a town. It was a mirror showing the empire how filthy it truly was. Clean stone roads stretched through the city. Shops lined both sides. Vendors shouted over the smell of hot food and sweet tea. Commoners laughed loudly in clothes without patches. Children ran across the street with bread in their hands. Every face looked healthy. Some citizens were even fat. Godfrey stared like he had entered a dream. The outer city of the royal capital could not compare to this. As dusk fell, Richard and Godfrey found an inn called Traveler's Rest. The sign carried a small official seal from the Lord. The plump innkeeper greeted them warmly. A first-class suite cost 5 gold coins. A second-class room cost 3. A third-class room cost 1. Godfrey nearly exploded. 5 gold coins for one night? Sounded like robbery. The innkeeper explained that this was a Lord-operated inn. During merchant season, even the cheapest room might sell out. Hearing that Silas himself owned the inn, Richard slapped down 5 gold coins. He wanted to see what a first-class room in Edenbrook looked like. A waiter led them upstairs and poured pale yellow tea. The water was clear. The fragrance was herbal and sweet. Godfrey took one sip and his eyes lit up. Richard also drank and found it crisp enough to shame royalty. Then Godfrey wandered into the washroom. A scream like a butchered pig ripped through the suite. Richard rushed in. Godfrey was bent over a white ceramic vessel. He thought it was a luxurious indoor well. The opening was small, but the water looked clear. Before Richard could stop him, Godfrey scooped some up and drank it. He praised the water as sweet and pure. Richard stared at the vessel and felt something deeply wrong. He pulled the rope to call the waiter. The waiter arrived, smiled, and explained the truth. That was not a well. It was a flush toilet, the kind of thing no one in this medieval world should have seen. Godfrey's smile died on his face. Richard's eyes turned into knives. The waiter proudly explained the hidden water tank and city sewers. When the rope was pulled, filth rushed away underground. Silas had ordered all cesspools kept far from the wells. That was why Edenbrook's drinking water tasted clean. Godfrey's stomach rolled violently. He bent over the very same toilet and vomited. The waiter clapped as if watching a familiar performance. He said many drunk merchants threw up exactly like that. Then he pulled the rope. Water rushed down, and the bowl became clean again. Richard watched in amazement. The waiter then revealed the saltwater spray and soft wiping paper. He warned them never to use rough wooden chips. Guard Captain Brutus had once punished a man brutally for ignoring that rule. Richard and Godfrey both clenched their backsides at the same time. That night, neither of them slept. They stared at the ceiling tank and the stack of white paper. Edenbrook had already conquered their dignity. The next morning, Richard took Godfrey through the streets again. Godfrey kept muttering that Silas wasted the people's wealth. Richard snorted coldly. If every lord wasted wealth like this, and made commoners prosperous, he would laugh in his sleep. At a street corner, a tea seller sang loudly about Edenbrook sweet tea. Godfrey thought the tune polluted his ears. He spat on the stone row. Instantly, an old woman with a red armband shot out like an arrow. She demanded 5 copper coins for spitting in public. Richard paid before Godfrey could explode. Then he asked why there were no beggars in Edenbrook. The old woman smiled and praised Silas for being kind-hearted. She said he could not bear to see poor people, so he sent them all to the mines to dig trenches. For a second, the emperor could not decide whether to laugh, rage, or call that mercy a crime. That was Edenbrook mercy. Brutal, efficient, and somehow terrifyingly effective. Suddenly, people shouted that a lawsuit was happening. Richard and Godfrey followed the crowd to the Lord's Hall. The building was grander than many royal offices. Inside, Silas sat lazily behind the judge's table. He looked like he had just woken up. A tavern owner named Tom knelt below. He accused a guard named Rufus of eating without paying. Rufus had smashed ale barrels and owed 17 silver coins. Silas's sleepy eyes sharpened instantly. He had ordered guards never to oppress commoners. Rufus admitted he had no money. He also owed a casino 10 silver coins. Silas ordered 20 military cane strokes. Rufus removed his armor himself, bit down on a leather strap to brace for the pain, and lay down obediently. The strokes tore his back bloody. Silas then cut his salary in half. He ordered him to sweep streets for 3 months. One more offense would mean banishment from Edenbrook. Rufus, pale and bleeding, actually thanked him for mercy. Richard's pupils trembled. Silas judged like a scoundrel, but his authority was terrifying. Even the punished guard did not dare complain. Tom then asked about his money. Silas spread his hands and said, Rufus had none. Tom looked crushed. Then Silas declared he would visit Tom's tavern that night. He would drink 3 cups as punishment and boost the tavern's business. Tom instantly became ecstatic. The court dismissed. As Silas left, his gaze swept over the crowd. He had already noticed 2 unfamiliar fat sheep. That evening, Silas arrived at Tom's tavern with Brutus and maid Tessa. Brutus roared that Lord Silas would pay for the whole venue. The diners rushed downstairs in joy. Tom tried to push Richard and Godfrey away. Godfrey refused to move. Silas sat directly at their table. Richard used the fake name Sir Richard and claimed to trade porcelain. Silas immediately entered business mode. He tried to sell them ceramic flush toilets. Richard praised 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 and casually said, "Even the emperor might not drink such tea." Silas slammed the table. His face filled with grief and righteous anger. He accused Richard of slandering his majesty. He declared that without Emperor Richard's victories, 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 would not exist. If the emperor could not drink this tea, Silas had no face to drink it either. Then he splashed his own cup onto the carpet. He shouted for God to bless the emperor. Richard froze with the teacup still in his hand. Godfrey stared in horror. Even the chief chamberlain felt inferior to this long-distance flattery. Silas then forced Godfrey to join the praise. Godfrey shouted the blessing with pain in his heart. Richard's face became ruddy. His impression of Silas improved immediately. Once the atmosphere was warm, Silas revealed his true blade. He said 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 tea would dominate the royal capital. Richard asked the price. Silas calmly said, 10 gold coins per ounce. Godfrey shouted that it was too expensive. Silas smiled like a merchant devil. He explained how to sell status instead of leaves. Package it as royal premium box tea. Say maidens picked each leaf with their lips. Say every leaf was sung over with a hymn. Tell nobles that without this tea, they could not enter high society. 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 did not seek the best. 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏 sought the most expensive. Godfrey covered his face. Richard realized he had already been arranged as a sheep to be slaughtered. After moonshine and several rounds of drinks, Richard made a decision. He bought 2,000 gold coins worth of tea. When the bill arrived, Tom charged 500 gold coins. Silas scolded him for robbery. Tom explained that Silas had promised to pay for everyone. The crowd had even eaten greenhouse melons worth 10 gold coins each. Silas rolled his eyes and told Brutus to pay. Brutus stepped forward and dropped a heavy leather bag onto the table. It contained exactly 500 gold coins. Richard and Godfrey stared at it. Brutus explained that Silas always carried 1,000 gold coins for peace of mind. Richard looked at Brutus's monstrous body and felt a chill. Carrying that much gold like loose change was not human strength. The next day, Richard and Godfrey signed the tea contract in a secret room. The room had no windows and was lit by whale oil lamps. A noble motto hung on the wall. Richard praised it. Silas placed tea bricks on the table and handed over 2 parchments. One was a commercial contract. The other was a terrifying non-disclosure agreement. The final clause said the right of final interpretation belonged to Silas. Richard's eyelids twitched. Silas acted as if this was completely normal. Then he pointed them toward a brass horn with a hand crank. He said they must read the agreement into the horn. Richard read. Brutus turned the crank. A needle carved dots into a tinfoil cylinder. It was Silas's homemade phonograph. If they ever broke the deal, he would play their recorded oath as evidence. After signing, Silas sent them out without ceremony. A carriage waited at the gate to take them back. Godfrey thought Silas was considerate. Then the coachman demanded 10 gold coins for the ride. Godfrey's face became black as a pot bottom. On the road back, rain turned the imperial highway into mud. The carriage sank and stumbled. The coachman fell into a puddle. Richard paid him off and walked on foot with Godfrey. When they entered the royal capital's outer city, the smell hit them like a slap. Sewage ran across the roads. Garbage and night soil were dumped openly in the streets. Ragged children played in filthy water. Richard thought of 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏𝗏's clean stone roads. His heart collapsed. He had always believed that ending war meant giving people peace. Now, he realized a frontier baron had done more for commoners than the emperor. Richard returned to the palace in a stormy mood. The Privy Council immediately complained about Crown Prince Edward. While Richard had been away, Edward skipped meetings. He did not study. Instead, he built a beast park and watched animals fight. Richard charged to the park. Edward was sitting in velvet, bored, watching a tiger tear an old horse. He complained that the world was peaceful, and he had no wars to win. He even said his father had stolen his future glory. Richard appeared behind him. He suggested Edward jump into the arena and fight the tiger. Edward nearly died of fear. Richard dragged him to the garden with a stick and whip. Edward claimed he was still developing. Richard noticed he was dressed suspiciously thick. Guards stripped him. 4 layers came off. Then a steel breastplate clattered to the ground. Richard ordered his pants removed. Iron buttock guards, greaves, chainmail, and knee pads fell everywhere. Richard went mad with rage. He said Edward was not worth one toe of the Baron of 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗚. Edward was tied upside down on a pillar. He screamed under the whip, but another hidden iron plate protected him. When Richard discovered that final trick, his eyes turned red. He was about to strip Edward completely when Godfrey arrived. Godfrey had investigated Baron Silas. The file said Silas graduated first from the Royal Academy at 15. The late king made him a knight as an exception. His parents were dead. He once contradicted the finance minister. As punishment, he had been sent to 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗚. His yearly reports claimed famine, poverty, and 2,000 people. Godfrey accused him of hiding more than 10,000 people and evading taxes. Richard did not get angry. He laughed. A genius who turned a wasteland into paradise was rare. He decided Silas might become Edward's future mentor. Then Richard remembered Silas's marketing lesson. He ordered Godfrey to repackage the tea in royal porcelain jars. 1 ounce per jar, 50 gold coins each. Godfrey nearly petrified. Richard was darker than Silas. The next morning, Godfrey carried hot tea through court. He called it tears of Venus. He claimed it came from a fairy tree in the mysterious East. He said it nourished vitality and was known as the secret of the lion. Old nobles laughed, but their eyes lit up. At court, Finance Minister Giles begged for disaster relief funds. A flood had struck the Lraine River Valley. The treasury had no money. Richard pulled 10,000 gold coins from his private stash. The ministers praised his generosity. They did not know he was preparing to harvest them with tea. After court, the noble houses fought to buy tears of Venus. The black market price rose almost immediately. Old ministers tasted ordinary herbal tea and imagined divine medicine. Meanwhile, in 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗚𝗏, Silas cursed workers in the tea workshop. He ordered them to separate the leaves from dry hay. This was an export luxury product for fat sheep. Quality control had to be stable. In 3 days, Richard made over 10,000 gold coins. He was furious and delighted at the same time. Nobles refused disaster donations but fought for expensive tea. So he prepared to return to 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗚 for more stock. Then he remembered Edward was still hanging in the garden. Godfrey released the crown prince after 3 full days. Edward roared in misery. Richard pretended to educate him. Then he made him kneel in the corner. Royal Inspector Oswald arrived next. Richard asked how many times he had inspected 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗚𝗏. Oswald claimed it was poor and nearly abandoned. Richard slammed the table. He had just returned from 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗚 himself. Oswald collapsed instantly. He confessed that Silas had caught him years earlier. Silas stripped him, painted a humiliating portrait, and threatened to print copies across the empire. Worse, Silas made him swear a shameful oath into the brass horn. The phonograph recorded every word. If Oswald talked, Silas would play the recording in public squares. Richard and Godfrey suddenly remembered their own recorded oath. Terror crawled across both their faces. Oswald also admitted Silas gave him a villa and 500 gold coins. Richard stripped Oswald of office and titles. Oswald rolled away gratefully, free to retire in his 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗚𝗏 villa. Godfrey muttered that Silas was not human. Richard smashed cups in fury. He wanted to drag Silas to the capital and whip him. But a worse disaster arrived first. A century-level flood broke through the Lraine River Valley. 5 stone dams collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of commoners were displaced. The treasury was nearly empty. Richard had no choice. He dragged Edward and Godfrey back to 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗚𝗏. At noon, Silas was sleeping under a goose-down quilt. Brutus woke him by shouting that the porcelain fat sheep had returned. Silas rushed to the travelers' rest inn where his guests were staying. A terrible stench greeted him at the door. The innkeeper confessed that a drunk guest had drained the water tower. The flush toilets could no longer flush. Richard walked downstairs, pinching his nose, with Edward and Godfrey behind him. Silas smiled as if nothing was wrong. He took them to the Silver Moon Grand Tavern. Richard immediately ordered 200 pounds of tea. Silas secretly admired the emperor's black heart. Cheap leaves had been turned into gold. Then the waiter served 𝗦𝗢𝗢𝗏𝗏 pork stew. Edward frowned and said pork was for serfs. Silas calmly explained castrated barrows. Cut young, pigs grew docile, gained meat, and lost the foul smell. He deliberately compared it to eunuchs and choir boys. Godfrey's face darkened like iron. Edward trembled from holding in laughter. Richard kicked him under the table. Richard tasted the pork, and his eyes lit up. After the meal, Richard spread out a military map. He pointed to the Lraine River Valley. He said a flood blocked merchants and swallowed the south. Silas studied Silver Gorge. Mountains stood on both sides of the river. Without thinking, he said that if heavenly thunder shattered the mountains, the river could be blocked. Richard's fork dropped. Godfrey stared as if seeing a monster. Edward jumped up, claiming he and Silas shared heroic vision. Silas realized he had slipped. He had secretly made tons of black powder for bandit defense. If exposed, his days as Edenbrook's local emperor would end. He laughed it off as a joke. Richard did not believe him. Later, while walking through the city, Richard asked why Silas respected merchants. Silas explained resource allocation. Wheat in a field was cheap grain. Brewed into premium whiskey, its value multiplied. Commerce was why Edenbrook prospered. Edward then found a street book about Silas battling demon King Baal. The ridiculous story embarrassed Silas. Edward mocked it for being written in the vulgar common tongue. Silas snapped back that books commoners could read were good books. More words meant more paper, ink, typesetting, jobs, and street sales. He called it stimulating domestic demand. Edward was speechless. Richard's gaze toward Silas changed again. That night, Richard met Silas privately in the garden. He asked directly whether Silas could solve the Lraine flood. Silas sighed and admitted he had a weapon called the Wrath of God. It could split mountains and block rivers, but it was dangerous. He demanded 50,000 gold coins. Richard said he had no cash. Silas immediately offered a low-interest loan through Edenbrook Commercial Bank. Richard gritted his teeth and agreed. Silas then warned him that floods were followed by plague. Corpses must be burned. Survivors must move to high ground. Low places must be disinfected with quicklime. Anyone coughing or feverish must be quarantined. Mouths and noses must be covered with boiled linen. Anyone spitting everywhere deserved broken legs. Richard looked at him with fanatic admiration. He grabbed a cup and drank it in one gulp as a toast. Silas froze. Richard had just drunk his mouthwash. Richard's face turned livid. He fled the garden in panic. Richard signed the loan, took 200 pounds of tea, and returned overnight. On the road back, Edward begged to become Silas's student. Richard promised that if Edward memorized 20 classical scriptures by heart, Silas would be brought into the Royal Academy to teach him. Back at the palace, ministers demanded flood relief money. Richard had learned from Silas. Since the treasury was empty, nobles would donate. No one was allowed to run. Meanwhile, Edward disguised himself and entered the lower city slums. The trip shattered his world. Compared to Edenbrook, the capital was a giant stinking ditch. A woman splashed rotten fish slop onto his boots. Edward entered her broken house. Inside, a man with a broken leg lay like a withered ghost. Their food was sour mush mixed with chaff, wild grass, and filth. Edward tasted a little. He vomited bile. The broken-legged man crawled down and ate the vomited mush from the floor. He cried that it was edible and could not be wasted. Edward froze. Shame burned through him. He had rejected palace study and Edenbrook pork, while subjects ate spoiled weeds. Godfrey quietly admitted that such mush was already a decent life for many. Edward finally understood hunger. He clenched his fists. He swore to memorize books and force Silas to become his mentor. In the royal court, the Lraine crisis worsened. The abyssal sea god cult rallied flood victims into rebellion. Ministers demanded troops and silver. Richard forced donations. Dozens of grand nobles together gave less than 4,000 gold coins. Richard nearly laughed from rage. He had earned more in 2 days. Noble honor had produced copper dust. He dispatched 15,000 troops anyway. Secretly, he was relying on Silas's miners. At Silver Gorge, rain poured like knives. Duncan, Edenbrook's mine foreman, led 20 miners with black powder. Royal Knight Commander Aldrich escorted them and looked down on them at first. But the miners carried heavy loads through mud like beasts. The knights panted behind them. Duncan shouted that each miner would earn 1,000 gold coins. That reward made the men howl like wolves. They stuffed powder into a mountain crevice. Aldrich stared at the fuse, unable to believe it. Duncan lit it. He ordered everyone to cover their ears. The next second, the earth roared. Heavenly thunder exploded from the mountain. Stones flew into the sky. The peak cracked, groaned, and collapsed into the river valley. Massive rocks blocked the raging flood. Waves rose like city walls. The knights lay flat in the mud, trembling like sinners before God. Duncan laughed and called them soft. Then he marched to the next peak and blew that one down too. The flood was diverted eastward. 10 days later, Richard faced furious ministers in court. A noble named Charles accused him of doing nothing for Lraine. Richard was almost unable to hold on. Then an urgent dispatch arrived. Richard read it. His eyes widened. Then he laughed toward the ceiling. He threw the letter at Charles and ordered him to read. The north and south peaks of Silver Gorge had collapsed. The river was blocked. The flood crisis was resolved. Before the court recovered, another report arrived. With the flood cut off, the army broke the abyssal sea god cult. The rebels fled. The high priestess vanished. The court exploded. Richard finally revealed the name behind the miracle: Silas of 𝗦𝗛𝗢𝗗𝗘𝗏. He promoted Silas to Viscount of 𝗦𝗛𝗢𝗏𝗏. He expanded the territory. He ordered Silas to enter the Royal Academy as Chief Grand Tutor. Silas would personally teach the Crown Prince. The ministers protested that Silas was too young. Edward jumped out to defend him. After witnessing the lower city slums and learning from Silas, he had memorized difficult texts with shocking discipline. The old scholar confirmed it. The court fell silent. Anyone who could reform Edward deserved the title. In 𝗦𝗛𝗢𝗗𝗏, Silas knew nothing of this disaster. He was reading the 3rd edition of his ridiculous Demon King biography. He wondered whether to imprison the author and force daily updates. Brutus rushed in. The miners had returned safely. They had also brought back a half-dead, mud-covered woman. At the clinic, Silas saw that the mud monkey was actually a peerless beauty. Her skin was snow white and her aura noble. She was no ordinary refugee. Before Silas could investigate, a royal edict arrived. A herald announced Silas's promotion and ordered him to report to the capital. The citizens surrounding the clinic exploded. They thought the royal capital was taking their lord away. Pitchforks and axes pressed toward the herald's neck. Some suggested burying him in the Black Forest. The herald collapsed in terror. Silas cursed everyone into silence. He said he was becoming a high official, not being sent to the guillotine. The citizens lowered their weapons while crying like children. Silas told Brutus to bribe the herald quietly. Brutus stuffed a huge bag of silver into the man's cloak. The weight knocked him down. Silas kicked Brutus aside and personally retrieved the bag. He even stole 2 silver coins and 5 coppers from the herald's pouch. The herald fled 𝗦𝗛𝗢𝗏𝗏 like a madman. Then the rescued beauty appeared. She introduced herself as Bianca. She claimed her family died in the flood. She begged to become Silas's maid to repay him. Silas immediately smelled trouble. A beauty offering herself after waking up was too suspicious. He told Tessa to give her travel money and walked away. Bianca chased him until she coughed blood and fainted. Later, she clutched Silas's pant leg and wept for her dead parents. Tessa's eyes went red with pity. Silas called it acting. He covered Bianca's mouth and pinched her nostrils until she had to wake up. Bianca's humiliation almost turned into murder, but she kept begging to stay. Silas finally allowed it. She would become Tessa's junior maid. More exactly, the maid of a maid. Her salary was 3 silver coins a month. Medical fees would be deducted. She had to sign a 1-year contract. Bianca fainted from anger. Silas then arranged 𝗦𝗛𝗢𝗏𝗏𝗏's affairs before leaving. He ordered the sheriff to break the legs of anyone who bullied citizens or disrupted trade. Sheriff Cole nervously confessed another problem. Several royal knights from the capital had been caught as spies. Silas almost fainted. They had not used physical torture. Instead, they made terrible bards sing brainwashing songs for 5 days. The knights broke mentally and confessed everything. Silas screamed to release them with gold and good food. He could not stay in 𝗦𝗛𝗢𝗏𝗏𝗏 1 second longer. He took 120,000 gold coins in bank drafts. Then he fled toward the royal capital with Brutus and Tessa. On the road, a crowd blocked his carriage. Silas thought assassins had arrived. Instead, it was 𝗦𝗛𝗢𝗏𝗏𝗏 citizens holding torches, food, and tears. Tom brought warm meat. Others threw eggs, cheese, and smoked meat into the carriage. Silas's nose stung. He cursed them for making the wind hurt his eyes. The people cried harder. They knew their lord might not return soon. Silas hid his face with a parchment book. He ordered the carriage onward. In the royal capital, his first task was buying a mansion. A merchant named Garrick demanded 2,000 gold coins. Silas offered 1,000. Garrick claimed powerful backing from finance minister Giles's son, Julian. Silas exposed Garrick's ugly scandals and lowered the price. Garrick tried to resist. Brutus struck a bodybuilding pose like a human bear. Silas reduced the price again because someone had died in the yard. Garrick surrendered at 600 gold coins. Brutus then flattened a gold bar into a pancake with his bare hands. Silas called the palm print artistic value. He counted it as part of the payment and reduced the cash again. Garrick fled with bloodshot eyes. Silas happily took the deed. The next morning, Bianca woke Silas with a punch to the face. She dressed him badly for court. His belt was a disaster. He arrived late at the palace. Running through corridors, he tripped on his robe. In front of the entire Privy Council, he slid on his knees into the hall. Silence filled the throne room. Silas instantly turned the fall into worship. He shouted praise for His Majesty's divine might. The ministers' faces turned green. Then Richard ordered him to raise his head. Silas looked up. His soul almost left his body. Sir Richard the tea merchant was the emperor. Godfrey was the chief chamberlain. Edward was the crown prince he had mocked with pig castration. Silas realized every enemy had already sat at his tavern table. Richard accused him of improper dress. Silas claimed the emperor's brilliance had burned his clothes open. Duke Arthur condemned him as a barbarian flatterer. Silas immediately asked whether praising the emperor was now a crime. He declared Richard the world's greatest knight and ruler. He asked whether Valoria could no longer tolerate a loyal man speaking truth. Duke Arthur shook with rage. Richard scolded Silas for insulting an elder statesman. Silas instantly praised Richard for not enjoying flattery like a tyrant. Duke Arthur nearly fainted. Grand Scholar Reginald then begged Richard to dismiss Silas. Silas's eyes lit up. He knelt and agreed that he had no talent. If dismissed, he could return to Edenbrook. Richard saw through him. He denied the request. Silas kept begging. Richard threw a brass inkwell that burst ink over his body. He declared Silas would be chief grand tutor whether he liked it or not. After court, Godfrey brought Silas to the royal study. Silas bribed him for information on the way. Inside, Richard left him standing until the pressure was perfect. Silas struck first. He offered 86,520 for gold coins from Edenbrook surplus. Richard accepted the money, but called it too little for such a rich territory. Silas claimed he had spent everything on roads and sewers. Richard's anger eased. Then he asked about the wrath of God. Silas pretended the black powder project was unfinished. He claimed the alchemist had blown himself up. He needed funding. Richard granted 20,000 gold coins and 1 year. Silas mourned on the outside and laughed inside. The weapon had already been mass-produced. Richard then asked how he would teach Edward. Silas gave his philosophy. If the crown prince makes mistakes, beat him. If he makes no mistakes, beat him to prevent future mistakes. Richard nodded in approval. He gave Silas a royal gold token. With it, Silas could discipline Edward freely. Silas left the palace covered in sacred ink. At home, he ordered Tessa to frame the stained robe. It would hang at the entrance as the place of imperially bestowed holy ink. That evening, Garrick stormed into the mansion with an invitation. Silas had Brutus slap him twice. Brutus searched him and found 500 gold coins. Garrick called it robbery. Silas dragged him to the framed robe. He charged him 500 gold coins as an admission ticket to view holy ink. Garrick was thrown into the street. The dropped letter was an invitation to the Silver Swan aristocratic salon. It came from Julian, the finance minister's son, and smelled like a trap from 3 streets away. Silas first wanted to tear it up and use it as toilet paper. Bianca suggested selling access to the invitation on the black market for money. Silas's eyes lit up, but he kept the original invitation in his sleeve. A trap made by nobles could still become his stage if he walked in prepared. He gave Bianca a 1% commission for spreading the rumor and selling a spare entry slot. The next morning, Silas leaned on a marble pillar in court and fell asleep standing. Afterward, Godfrey sent him to the Crown Prince's academy. Edward appeared bruised and swollen. Seeing Silas, he rushed over like a lost puppy. Silas immediately praised his heroic aura. Edward was moved beyond reason. He complained that Richard had beaten him again. Silas called the beating fatherly love. He said the scars gave Edward masculine battlefield charm. Edward believed him instantly. Silas then gave him 10,000 gold coins as brotherly pocket money. Edward had never seen so much cash. After fake refusal, he accepted and called Silas his good brother. Grand Scholar Reginald entered with a black face. He scolded Silas for joking with the crown prince. Silas snapped back. Reginald then insulted the palace attendants as incomplete people. The eunuchs lowered their heads in shame. Silas seized the chance. He roared that the hardest work in the palace was done by those attendants. Many had mutilated themselves only to feed their families. A true scholar should have compassion. The attendants cried. Edward listened in awe. Reginald fled in anger. Silas told Edward the first lesson: to make people submit willingly, treat them with a sincere heart. The next day, Edward begged Silas to help him escape the palace, and Silas remembered the silver swan invitation still waiting in his sleeve. So he decided to walk straight into Julian's trap, using the crown prince as the sharpest shield in the capital. At the Silver Swan River Salon, Brutus came as guard and scared nobles away from their table. Silas and Brutus focused on eating pastries. Then Julian arrived with lackeys. He mocked Silas as a mud-legged noble. He demanded that Silas compose a poem. Silas quietly threatened him with Brutus's hidden knives. Julian nearly collapsed, but Lord Nelson, heir to the Duke of Normandy, stepped in. Nelson stirred the crowd into chanting for a poem. Silas sighed and took a quill. He translated a famous Eastern farewell poem into a Western sonnet. The autumn wind, bitter wine, distant ships, and cold moon stunned the room. The nobles held their breath. Then Silas forgot the last two lines. His mind went blank. He slapped the desk and called it intentional blank practice. The remaining lines would be completed by the audience. The nobles praised his artistic generosity. Julian asked for the romantic story behind the poem. Nelson suggested Silas had not written it. The atmosphere sharpened. Silas smiled. If it was difficult, then they would not do it. Brutus flipped a heavy table onto Julian and Nelson. Silas, Brutus, and Edward jumped onto the table and stomped wildly. The two nobles screamed underneath. Edward's face turned red with excitement. The entire salon fled in terror. When Brutus lifted the table, Julian and Nelson were half dead. Silas ordered Brutus to strip them. He stacked them naked on the table and poured liquor over them. Then he called servants to witness the scene. With a sorrowful face, he claimed the two had violated knightly virtues while drunk. He warned everyone to keep it confidential. The servants understood the sick joke immediately. Julian and Nelson woke under ice water. Seeing themselves naked and surrounded, they turned deathly pale. Silas warned that if any servant had an accident, he would blame them. Both nobles agreed through gritted teeth. Julian claimed it had only been a verbal altercation. Silas helped them dress and sent them home. Afterward, Silas packed leftover roast meat and pastries. Opera diva Isabella invited him upstairs. She offered to play the harp and hinted at her purity. Silas ignored her and packed her snacks too. On the street, Edward gave leftovers to a beggar. Silas decided to teach him social darkness. He exposed a fake blind beggar by offering imaginary silver. Then he exposed a fake legless beggar by throwing the man's bowl away. The cripple suddenly grew legs and chased it. Edward's worldview cracked again. Silas admitted he once built a beggars' guild in Edenbrook to survive. He had played every scam before. Edward admired him even more. Julian returned home and refused to admit what happened. Finance Minister Giles was furious. Anyway, he decided to impeach Silas. Bianca heard rumors and misunderstood Silas's tastes. When Silas gave her a few saliva-covered copper coins as commission, she cried and ran off. 2 days later, Godfrey read Silas's unfinished poem in court. The ministers were enchanted. Prime Minister Ward cried. Richard asked why the poem lacked 2 lines. Silas panicked. Then he claimed incompleteness itself was imperfect divinity. Like a broken statue, the blank space made the poem sacred. The ministers rolled their eyes, yet some began to believe it. Giles then accused Silas of assaulting Julian. Julian was brought in. Silas calmly called it the Roman Bacchus pyramid drinking game. Julian trembled, remembering the naked table disaster. He chose shameful silence over public ruin. He admitted Silas had not hit him. Giles nearly coughed blood. Richard kicked the matter away. After court, Richard asked Silas how to keep selling tea. Silas proposed market segmentation. Longevity tea for old nobles. Beauty tea for noble ladies. Warrior tea for young knights. Each needed luxury packaging, myths, theater promotion, and lower prices. Richard gave him 10% of the profits. Then Richard asked if he could produce grain. Silas sighed. He had not found potatoes or sweet potatoes yet. At that moment, Godfrey rushed in. Princess Victoria was dying. Richard and Edward ran to her chamber. Silas grabbed Leo, Edward's personal palace attendant, a young eunuch who still dreamed of being whole again, and used that impossible promise to make him lead the way. Victoria lay pale on the bed, beautiful even in sickness. Richard said physicians had treated her lung disease for 10 years. Silas grabbed Chief Physician Hugo and suspected quackery. Edward became desperate. He even suggested marrying Victoria to Silas as divine blessing therapy. Silas rejected that madness. He said there might be a medicine called penicillin. Hope returned to Edward's eyes. They gathered moldy oranges, boiled wheat, culture, and crude purification tools. Silas built 27 experimental batches. He used Edenbrook toilet paper as filter paper. Silversmiths made handmade syringes. For half a month, he worked until his eyes were bloodshot. Then he tested the medicine on death row prisoners. He promised golden pardons if they survived. Some objected. The jailers slapped them silent. Silas injected over 50 criminals. An hour later, Edward rushed in, asking whether it succeeded. Silas turned with endless sorrow. They were all dead. Corpses filled the cells. Some had convulsed. Some had vomited violently. The jailers looked at Silas like he was the dungeon poison king. Penicillin failed. Victoria's condition worsened again. Silas finally investigated her environment. He bribed a maid with an 80 gold coin note. The maid led him to the royal greenhouse. Purple-red siren sigh flowers filled the garden. Victoria had loved them for years. Silas understood instantly. It was not lung consumption. It was pollen allergy. He rushed back and told Edward the princess could be saved. Edward thought Silas had agreed to marry her. Silas nearly cursed his ancestors. He explained the allergy. Edward ordered the entire greenhouse uprooted. Inside Victoria's chamber, Hugo prepared an expensive mandrake soup. Edward kicked him. The pot shattered. A root rolled out onto the floor. Silas stared at it. His blood almost boiled. It was not mandrake. It was a sweet potato. The divine crop he had searched for years had been stewed as medicine. Silas grabbed Hugo by the neck and demanded the source. In the royal pharmacy, they found 3 tiny sweet potatoes. Silas told Edward 1 acre could produce over 1,000 pounds. Plant it successfully and hunger could be defeated. Edward held the box like imperial treasure. The purchasing officer Simon confessed he bought them for 2 silver coins. But he claimed 2,000 gold coins in expenses. He had also hidden 2 baskets. Silas recovered the gold notes. He handed Edward 1,000 and secretly kept 1,000. He called it safeguarding funds. Silas then told Richard that Victoria's illness was caused by pollen. Staying away from the flowers gave her a high chance of recovery. Godfrey's head would guarantee it. Godfrey's face twitched violently. Richard was overjoyed. Silas requested leave to return to Edenbrook. He needed to supervise tea and research. He also needed to escape before the prisoner deaths exploded in court. Richard granted permission. Edward wanted to follow. Silas told him to stay and absorb the political thunder. Edward could only watch as Silas left with sweet potatoes and research notes. When Silas returned to Edenbrook, a roadside serf saw him and ran screaming. Soon everyone rushed toward the city. Silas thought rebellion had begun. Instead, the city gate was packed with citizens and children holding flowers. A banner welcomed Lord Viscount Silas home. The children shouted a warm welcome. Silas recognized the exact trick he once used to fool Inspector Oswald. He roared for them to stop. Some children cried. The adults cheered louder. They said only their real lord cursed with that authentic flavor. Back at the Lord's Hall, Acting Consul Austin reported progress. Literacy campaigns were spreading. Garbage sorting had begun. A stage play called The Crazy Manor Lord became wildly popular. The actors played villains so well the audience beat them into the clinic. The glass workshop had finally made clear bubble-free glass. Silas immediately ordered telescopes and microscopes. He assigned herbalists to continue penicillin research on animals. First, Austin also reported spies in the city. 6 belonged to the Abyssal Sea God cult. 5 were sent by Finance Minister Giles. The captured spies were brought in. Austin shouted Edenbrook's goal. All 11 shouted that they would build Edenbrook into the Empire's most prosperous territory. The 6 heretics even wanted to sacrifice blood for Edenbrook. Silas was horrified by their enthusiasm. He ordered them sent to a monastery until they learned to be normal, lazy people. The 5 spies from Giles begged to stay. They had eaten meat soup every day, and no longer wanted the capital. One had already gone back to fetch his mother. Silas laughed that Edenbrook's sugar-coated bullets were invincible. He then found former Inspector Oswald living comfortably in town. Oswald had even started writing melodramatic romance scripts. Silas summoned him and hinted at past corruption. Oswald immediately laid out 7,600 gold coins in illegal gains. He also returned Silas's old hush money. Silas kept the illegal gains and returned the hush money. Then he assigned Oswald to interrogate prisoners by singing. A mute bartender named William made strange sounds nearby. Rufus translated the sounds. Silas discovered Rufus could understand mutes and even animal bleats. He called Rufus a walking translation machine. Since overseas merchants at Port Solis needed interpreters, Rufus had to return to the capital with him. The sweet potatoes were planted in guarded experimental fields. Rough microscopes could already reveal tiny life in water. Before leaving again, Silas ordered paper and textile workshops to produce sanitary pads. He planned to promote them among noble ladies. It would improve women's health and make money. Back in the capital mansion, the dining table was piled with the strange products. Silas asked Tessa how the 4 linen strings were used. Tessa blushed and said they tied around the waist. Silas realized ancient women lacked proper undergarments. Another business idea appeared. He ordered every woman in the mansion to receive 3 pads daily and report problems. Tessa nearly died from shame. Bianca stared as if her lord was a pervert. Edward soon rushed in with news. The death row poison case had exploded in the capital. Silas yawned and took him to the palace instead. Leo stared at Silas with shining hope. He still wanted his missing part restored. Silas gave him a magnifying glass. He called it the mirror of restored glory. Wherever something was short, shine it there, and it would look bigger. Leo ran away joyfully. Moments later, he returned, crying. It only looked bigger, but remained broken. Silas patted his shoulder and gave philosophical nonsense about optics. Edward laughed until his thigh hurt. Then Edward warned that the court was too quiet. The old ministers were probably holding back a major attack. Silas ignored it and asked about Victoria. Edward said she had recovered and wanted to thank him. They visited her chamber. Victoria looked lively after her illness. Silas tried to flirt by advising hot chamomile tea. Edward ruined the mood by asking what came after hot tea. Silas had nothing. Victoria noticed his bundle. Silas opened it, expecting candied nuts. Tessa had hidden sanitary pads inside. Edward snatched one and thought it was an epidemic mask. He tried to tie it over his face. Silas almost died from panic. He confessed it was called the pad of purity. It was for women's monthly bleeding. The air froze. Victoria and the maids blushed deeply. Edward called Silas a pervert. Silas exploded. He declared he was fighting for the health and dignity of women. Dirty rags and plant ash caused infection. The church wrongly shamed women as unclean. A lord could not pretend not to see it. Edward mocked Edenbrook's official red light districts. Silas argued that legal districts protected women better than gangs. Regular health checks, clear prices, and factory jobs gave them a way out. He said he walked the criminal path so criminals would have no path left. His speech shone with terrifying righteousness. The maids were moved. Victoria's eyes filled with admiration. She agreed to promote the pads among women in court. Silas added that the paper mill hired female workers. Women could earn money and stop being appendages to men. Victoria was dizzy with emotion. She donated her private savings to build factories. Silas accepted without hesitation. He promised to supply all her pads of purity. Then he listed prices for noble ladies and ordinary maids. Edward saw the profit and immediately wanted in. He claimed as crown prince he should lead the reform. Not buying the pads would become immoral. Silas secretly praised him. The child had learned. The next morning, Silas entered court with a telescope tucked behind his waist. Finance Minister Giles finally launched his attack. He accused Silas of illegally expanding his castle walls. He accused him of abducting serfs. He accused him of evading taxes for 7 years. Silas remained calm. Giles brought in Thomas, the former mayor of Oaktown. Thomas cried that Silas had exchanged Edenbrook's weak and sick for Oaktown's young laborers. Then the Edenbrook people showed off bread and meat until Oaktown's youth went mad with envy. They ran away to Edenbrook. Oaktown became Oak Village. Later, Silas sent back the old and weak, and more people ran away. Oak Village became Oak Manor. The court nearly burst with laughter. Thomas then accused Edenbrook of dumping fermented waste into his river. Silas sold him Edenbrook well water afterward. Sympathy filled the hall. Silas told Thomas he should thank him for a lighter job title. Then he argued that the serfs came voluntarily. Fermented waste was top-tier fertilizer. Nobles who could not feed people had no right to complain when people left. Giles asked why Silas did not simply give money and grain. Silas pointed at Thomas's fat body. If a ruler was fat while his people starved, giving him grain was feeding a parasite. Thomas cried that being born fat was not a crime. Silas ignored him. He looked upward and declared his dream. Fight for bread for the commoners. Preserve glory for the empire. Create peace for all generations. Achieve common prosperity across Valoria. Richard slammed the table in excitement. He praised Silas as the empire's bulwark. Giles gritted his teeth and pressed the tax charge. Silas admitted Edenbrook had not paid. He said the money went into roads, sewers, and basic education. Richard fined him 1 year's salary and ended the matter. Then Reginald attacked. He accused Silas of poisoning 54 royal prisoners. He also accused him of abusing corpses by crushing their sternums. The hall retreated from Silas as if he carried plague. Silas admitted the prisoners died during medicine tests for Victoria. He explained that chest compressions were emergency treatment. He listed the prisoners' crimes. Murderers, torturers, and baby-killing cultists had filled the cells. The ministers fell silent. Even Richard's anger eased. Reginald tried to raise Hugo's assault next. Edward descended the steps with a cold face. He told Reginald to be careful. Then he recited 20 difficult Latin scriptures in one breath. No mistakes. The court was shocked. The once useless crown prince had truly changed. Edward then exposed palace corruption. A plant worth 2 silver coins had been claimed as 2,000 gold coins. Eggs in the palace cost 10 silver coins each, while outside they cost 5 coppers. Food expenses had been inflated by more than 70,000 gold coins. Edward said commoners starved while parasites were silk. The hall became silent enough to hear breathing. Richard's eyes filled with tears. His son had grown. He ordered Godfrey to investigate palace corruption. He dismissed Reginald. He placed the Royal Academy solely under Silas. He allowed Edward to inspect the people freely. Then Silas offered the telescope. He called it the Eye of the Empire. It could see enemy banners miles away. Richard tested it and treated it like a divine object. He rewarded Edenbrook with 100 pounds of gold. He ordered mass production for the Royal Knights. Silas almost failed to hide his smile. After court, Edward dragged him back. He complained that Silas had not shown him the telescope first. Silas asked where Edward had spent his money. Edward proudly showed gratitude scrolls from the lower city. He had given all his money to starving commoners. Silas was speechless. Throwing money directly made him a walking purse. Edward then asked when the Pad of Purity business would earn profit. He had no money left for good deeds. He wanted fast money. Silas's eyes sharpened. Reginald was gone. Edward could leave the palace. The noble circle of the capital had become their private treasury. Silas asked whether any festival was approaching. Edward immediately mentioned Midsummer Valentine's Day. His eyes glowed like lamps. He asked how they would make a big move. Silas looked at the excited crown prince. He knew the empire had created its own most dangerous merchant prince. From that moment, the relationship between Silas and Edward changed. Edward no longer saw him only as a funny brother. He saw him as a door. Behind that door were roads, sewers, factories, banks, weapons, medicine, and lies sharp enough to cut nobles open. Silas no longer saw Edward only as a spoiled royal brat. He saw raw imperial authority. If trained badly, Edward would become a disaster. If trained well, he might become the first ruler who understood commoners as people. That was more frightening than any black powder, because a cannon could break a wall, but a changed heir could break an entire age. The old nobles sensed it too. They had mocked Silas as vulgar. They had called him shameless. They had called him a barbarian from the mud. But every time they attacked, they discovered another hidden blade. Attack his city walls, and he talked about feeding commoners. Attack his poetry, and he invented the beauty of incompleteness. Attack his violence, and Edward exposed palace corruption. Attack his money, and Richard found that Silas could earn more than ministries. Even his worst scandals became tools. The poison prisoner disaster turned into proof of desperate medicine. The tea scam turned into emergency relief funding. The sanitary pads became moral reform and a women's industry. The telescope became military technology. The sweet potatoes became the seed of a food revolution. And through all of it, Silas kept pretending he only wanted to return home. In truth, he was being dragged deeper into the imperial center. Richard needed his money. Edward needed his teaching. Victoria admired his strange righteousness. Godfrey feared his traps. The ministers hated him. The commoners were beginning to worship him. That combination was explosive. Back in Edenbrook, the experimental fields guarded the tiny sweet potatoes like sacred relics. Austin's officials recorded every sprout. Farmers watched the soil as if gold might grow from it. If the crop survived, one harvest could change the empire's stomach. Hungry villages would no longer need to choose between bark, weeds, and death. But if the nobles controlled it first, sweet potatoes could become another chain. Silas understood this perfectly. Grain was not just food. Grain was power. Whoever controlled hunger controlled loyalty. That was why he had hidden the baskets and notes so carefully. At the same time, the glass workshop prepared lenses. The first telescopes were crude, but they opened distance. The first microscopes were rough, but they opened the invisible world. Silas knew what that meant. Once Edenbrook saw germs, medicine would stop being blind prayer. Once soldiers saw farther, battle would stop being guesswork. Once factories learned precision, everything else would accelerate. The empire thought Silas had offered one divine artifact. In reality, he had started a pipeline. Roads led to trade. Trade led to tax. Tax led to workshops. Workshops led to tools. Tools led to weapons. Weapons led to fear. Fear led to bargaining power. That was the true system hidden beneath Edenbrook's cheerful markets. Silas joked, cursed, lied, and bootlicked. But every shameless move protected a machine that was quietly growing teeth. Richard saw only parts of it. A profitable tea business. A useful tutor. A strange weapon. A miracle crop. A clever telescope. Godfrey saw more. He saw contracts with traps. Oaths recorded in brass. Inspectors turned into retirees. Spies converted by meat soup. Citizens ready to kill royal heralds to keep their lord. Godfrey feared that Edenbrook was no longer just a territory. It was a different kind of country, wearing the empire's skin. Edward saw something else. He saw lower city hunger. He saw Edenbrook prosperity. He saw corrupt accounts. He saw how jokes could hide lessons. He saw that a ruler could use money, shame, stories, and systems instead of only swords. That was why he clung to Silas. Not because Silas was noble. Not because Silas was kind in the ordinary way. But because Silas made the impossible look like a business plan. Victoria saw yet another side. She saw a man willing to discuss shameful women's health before nobles and maids. She saw someone turn embarrassment into dignity. She saw a future where women could earn wages and buy safety. That admiration would bring opportunities. It would also bring danger. Because once royal women supported Silas's goods, noble households could not ignore them. Finance Minister Giles understood that danger best. His son had been humiliated. His spies had defected. His corruption was exposed. His impeachment had failed. Every attack made Silas richer, louder, and harder to kill. For Giles, this was no longer a political disagreement. It was a war for survival. If Silas kept growing, old noble money would be dragged into sunlight. Secret accounts would bleed. Private monopolies would crack. Palace parasites would lose their nests. So the next strike would not be as clumsy as Garrick or Julian. It would be sharper. It would come through salons, festivals, markets, and maybe assassins. Silas probably knew that. That was why his first instinct was never honor. It was leverage. Before enemies moved, he needed their secrets. Before nobles spoke, he needed their desires. Before ministers attacked, he needed the emperor's profit tied to his survival. And before Edward gave away all his money again, Silas needed a business big enough to feed his new addiction. Midsummer Valentine's Day was perfect. Nobles wanted romance. Young knights wanted face. Ladies wanted novelty. Merchants wanted access. Poets wanted fame. Every desire could become a price tag. Silas could already imagine it. Limited edition love tea. Perfumed paper. Valentine poems printed in common tongue. Charity auctions under Victoria's name. Exclusive salon tickets controlled by Edward. A public campaign selling dignity, romance, and moral superiority at the same time. If nobles paid, they looked refined. If they refused, they looked heartless. That was the perfect trap. The same method that sold cheap leaves as tares of Venus could sell paper and cloth as civilization. Edward leaned over the table, waiting for the plan. His bruised face was still swollen, but his eyes were bright. He was no longer the bored boy watching beasts fight. He was a prince who had seen hunger and wanted money to fight it. Silas looked at him and felt rare satisfaction. Maybe the student was troublesome. Maybe he was reckless. Maybe he still thought masks could be tied from sanitary pads. But he was learning. And once Edward learned how systems worked, the empire would never be the same. Still, Silas had no intention of becoming a saint. He would save people if there was profit. He would reform customs if reform sold well. He would help the poor while charging nobles double. He would praise the emperor while emptying the emperor's pockets. He would teach the crown prince while trying every day to escape work. That contradiction was exactly what made him dangerous. Pure villains were predictable. Pure heroes were easy to trap. Silas was neither. He was a transmigrator with a merchant's greed, a ruler's instinct, and a comedian's shameless mouth. His enemies could not decide whether to fear him, hate him, or buy from him. By the time they chose, he had already written the contract. Somewhere in the capital, Giles sharpened his next accusation. Somewhere in Edenbrook, sweet potato vines pushed through guarded soil. Somewhere in the palace, Victoria prepared to promote the pad of purity. Somewhere in a corner, Leo mourned before a magnifying glass. Somewhere in Godfrey's office, reports about Silas multiplied like plague rats. And in the crown prince's palace, Edward waited for the next lesson. Silas tapped the table slowly. The room fell quiet. Brutus stood nearby like a wall of meat and knives. Rufus listened carefully, ready to translate any language, maybe even goat bleats. Tessa hid her embarrassment behind a servant's calm face. Bianca watched from the side, still unsure whether Silas was a genius, a devil, or simply insane. Silas smiled. Midsummer Valentine's Day would not be a festival. It would be a battlefield. The weapons would not be swords. They would be scarcity, status, gossip, romance, guilt, and beautifully printed lies. Edward's eyes grew brighter with every word. He had found something more exciting than beast fights. He had found politics that could make money. Silas had found something more useful than a spoiled prince. He had found a royal shield with legs. The empire had found something it did not yet understand. A frontier baron had brought modern tricks into a medieval world. Roads had already changed how people moved. Sewers had changed how people lived. Tea had changed how nobles wasted money. Black powder had changed how disasters were solved. Sweet potatoes would change how peasants survived. Telescopes would change how armies fought. Pads would change how women spoke about their bodies. And Edward's awakening would change how the throne looked at its people. None of this had been planned cleanly. Most of it began with accidents, scams, curses, and Silas trying to avoid responsibility. Yet step by step, the whole empire was being pulled into Edenbrook's rhythm. That was the real miracle. Not the asphalt road. Not the flush toilet. Not the exploding mountains. The miracle was that one selfish baron kept building systems that made everyone around him stronger. Richard gained money and a better heir. Edward gained purpose. Victoria gained health and a cause. Commoners gained bread, roads, and dignity. Edenbrook gained legend. And Silas gained exactly what he always claimed he did not want. More power, more enemies, more work. From this day forward, the Valoria Empire would move according to a new rule. Wherever Silas stepped, the old world would be dragged screaming into the future.